So Valero was built in 1969. It's an integrated facility, which means that each part of the process flows into the unit next to it. And as such, pieces of the process cannot be easily operated independently without shutting down the entire facility. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that's important later on. In terms of the size of the facility, it's one of 5 refineries here in the Bay Area, and it processes approximately 165,000 barrels of crude oil a day. That's roughly equivalent to 7 million gallons of crude oil per day. In terms of what we regulate there, we have storage tanks, emission sources, abatement devices, including the 3 flares, emission point sources, and then a spaghetti or forest of thousands of valves, flanges, pumps, and connectors, all of which have air district emission limits. Next slide, please. So here in the picture on the left, you see the vent pipe, which is the source of the emissions we'll be discussing tonight. On the right, you see where the pipe sits approximately in relation to the facility and the community. And those of you who are eagle-eyed will also notice that there's a steam plume coming from the vent itself in the picture on the left. And that steam was a complicating factor in the identification of this emission source that I'll discuss with you later. Next slide, please. So relative to this emissions point, the Air District believes that it was in existence as far back as 2000 when Valero acquired the facility. Valero began sampling emissions from this source as far back as 2003 for its production purposes. And even though the facility had multiple chances to come forward to report and minimize these emissions, it failed to do so. In fact, an exhaustive search of our permitting applications for this facility show no declaration of the existence of this emissions point, which led to the incorrect assumption that it was just a steam vent. In reality, this vent was emitting approximately 4,000 pounds of hydrocarbon per day, thousands of pounds over the limit in Air District regulations. Based on Valero and Air District samples taken for this vent, we estimate the total emissions from this source to be between 2003 and 2020 to be over 10,000 tons of hydrocarbons, which included 138 tons of toxic air contaminants, specifically the compounds benzene, ethylbenzene, toluene, and xylene. At the public meeting the other night, your community asked us what other chemicals were included in the hydrocarbon fraction of the emissions, and those compounds were primarily 65% butane, 18% propane, 11% pentane, with lesser percentages of ethane and propylene. At the time the Air District discovered these emissions, we did a health risk assessment to determine if there was any indicated impacts on the community that would require the facility to install controls per our regulations. And while the Air District's modelling is used to determine what needs to be done to protect those most vulnerable to pollution, including children, our tools cannot tell us whether people actually became sick from exposure as a result of these emissions. Factors that influence health outcomes that are not included in our emissions tools include how much you were exposed to, the duration of that exposure, what your general health, age, and lifestyle are. But the results of our modelling did show projected cancer health risk and acute health hazard risk numbers in excess of the limits where the facility would have had to control these regulations or these emissions under Air District regulation. Finally, while the Air District has determined the nature and extent of these releases, we're not medical or human health experts. Therefore, the Air District has provided its data to the Solano County Public Health Department for their review. And at our meeting on February 24th, Dr. Matthias, the county health officer, was asked about the health impacts from these emissions. And while I don't want to put words in his mouth, he did state at that particular time it was impossible to tell what had happened as a result of these emissions historically, but he could not rule out health impacts from these emissions in the Benicia community. Next slide, please. Okay, so now a little bit about the investigation that took us to this point. In December 2018, the Air District received a report from another refinery where a control vent had released to the atmosphere. As a result, the Air District launched an investigation into all 5 Bay Area refineries to see if similar events existed at those facilities. By March of 2019, it was determined that Valero had an unreported and uncontrolled vent, and at that point, the Air District issued a notice of violation to the facility to cease those emissions. All the while continuing at the same time to investigate other issues associated with this release. As a result of the violation, Valero proposed an engineering fix seeking to remedy the emissions releases. By October of 2019, that fix was in place, and the Air District and Valero continued to monitor the vent to see if the emissions issue had indeed been fixed. By May of 2020, it became clear that the emissions had not been mitigated, but continued during startup, shutdown, and malfunction periods. And since that time, we've seen a number of proposals for additional fixes by Valero, but none, in our opinion, solved the emissions problem, and that's why the Air District is taking Valero to its hearing board. Next slide, please. So where are we with the emissions from this vent today? So while the initial engineering fix reduced hydrocarbon emissions substantially, the facility is still emitting enough during startup, shutdown, and malfunctions to exceed limits in Air District regulations that require controls to protect public health. Next slide, please. Here you see areas in Benicia in red and yellow where emissions exceed the thresholds in Air District regulations that require Valero to install controls. Again, these are modeled emissions representing a worst case scenario and do not indicate actual health impacts. But what is clear is that action is needed to bring this facility into compliance. Next slide, please. This action will occur on March 15, 2022, when the Air District will request a stipulated order of abatement at its hearing board. The stipulated order is targeted only at eliminating the emissions violation, and the Air District's investigation into reporting and permitting issues associated with this release is still ongoing. The stipulated order of abatement will bind Valero to eliminating these emissions as soon as feasible, but no later than the next refinery turnaround. And in order to cure this situation, the facility will require Air District permits and may also require analysis under the California Environmental Quality Act and or require city building permits. In the interim, the Air District will continue to monitor emissions from this vent, and any additional emissions and the cost of the final fix will be factored into the penalty for this violation. So finally, next slide, please. I'd like to talk a little about what we heard from your community at an informational meeting we had last week. A recording for that meeting will be online shortly, and I strongly advise the members of the council here to take a look at it so that you can understand the stress, fear, and frustration expressed by the attendees. I'm also going to apologize to those attendees before I begin this summary. This is my take on what we heard at the meeting, and in no way represents a comprehensive retelling of the comments we heard from the community. But in Benicia, you have an engaged, intelligent, and well-informed group of citizens who had questions about why this violation was not caught earlier, what the health impacts of these emissions were, why did the monitoring network surrounding this facility not pick up those emissions, how did the extensive Air District presence at the facility not detect this vent, how can the community help to monitor the facility in real time, and when will the Air District's community monitor be operational? They also wanted to know what the danger to the community and their children were from the facility and its repeated releases. They wanted to know why they were not informed about this violation for so long. They also had questions about whether the facility would be prosecuted for a negligent criminal or other charges, and how the Air District was working with the US EPA, the California Air Resources Board, the California Attorney General, or the Solano County District Attorney. They wanted to know and asked repeatedly how much the facility would be fined and who will get the penalty money. and how the Air District will keep the community informed about future emissions violations at the facility. Whose responsibility is it to tell residents what actions to take to protect themselves during events at the facility, and what other things are they being exposed to as a result of operations at this facility and at the port in general. There's a lot to unpack there, and it took four hours to tell. But the major takeaways for the Air District are that we need to be better at keeping the community informed. We need to act quicker, and our actions need to be transparent and stronger to deter non-compliance at this facility. We also need to be better able to monitor this facility, and we need to bring partners to the table to keep this community informed in real time if there are releases that impact health from the facility itself. Thank you for your attention, and I'll now pause to answer questions.